God's Not Dead 2 may have been one of the worst movie-watching experiences of my life. And I don't say this because it was dumb, spiteful propaganda. I mean, God's Not Dead 1 was dumb, spiteful propaganda, but it was reasonably well constructed and made for a pretty fun bad movie night. If, you try to forget the chilling fact that we live in a culture full of evangelicals who take it seriously. So you can imagine my surprise when I popped in God's Not Dead 2 expecting more of the same. Only to discover it was, well, just tedious. And way more boring and tedious than the first one. So what was the difference? Was I just in different moods when I watched them? Was the unintentional humor just played out by the time I got through the second movie? Or was there something qualitatively different about the two films? This made me curious enough to watch it again, and upon further review I've concluded that the movie just sucks. And I think it sucks in a way that made it boring for its intended audience as well as for recreational train wreck watchers like me. This might be why it made only a third of the domestic gross of its predecessor, and part of why the whole franchise has never really gained much momentum. See, while God's Not Dead was a steaming pile of garbage, it at least made competent use of the language of cinema, weaving emotionally evocative scenes into a reasonably paced movie that conveyed a lot through insinuation and sentiment. Was it overly syrupy and ham-fisted? Yes. Was it dumb as f***? Absolutely. But it knew that its audience liked certain syrupy, ham-fisted things that are dumb as f***, and it spoke to that audience well. God's Not Dead 2, however, failed to do almost any of this. It was poorly structured and tediously paced, setting up the wrong questions from the start and then resolving them through disjointed lectures, eventually unraveling to the point that it became too logically and emotionally incoherent even for its own audience. Of course, that's not to say it never got anything right, and in fact it did a great job of deceptively setting up its main scenario before coming unraveled. So in this video, I'm going to cover what it did right, and next time I'll address what it did wrong and how the whole movie fell apart. And by covering both of these points, hopefully we'll learn a lot about the mechanics of this style of propaganda and how it works on Christians. Okay, so what does this movie get right? Well, first, 1, it makes good use of imagery and insinuation. At the start. These movies are at their best, and by that I mean effectively being horrible, when they remember that, as the trite old phrase says, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I would personally add that, in the language of cinema, a well-assembled sequence of moving pictures with music is worth 10,000 words. I didn't actually run the calculations, but I think the general idea is pretty solid. God's Not Dead 1 leaned on this principle really heavily. It suggested a lot through visuals and music, to the extent that I'd basically call it an assemblage of montages tied together to culminate in its loudest, biggest montage at the end. God's not dead, he's surely alive. Each piece was very clear about what you were supposed to feel. It didn't get into the nitty-gritty of tedious things like fleshing out actual ideas. It was a fluff piece. Even its confrontations and debates were quick, flashy, and designed to lead you to prepackaged conclusions. And it mostly kept you focused on how intensely you already believe what you do and how you feel about people who believe otherwise. God's Not Dead 2 opens by doing a lot of the same, throwing crowd-pleasing images at you faster than you can consciously notice them. On the surface, this can look like little more than cynically ticking off boxes of things that give Christians the warm and fuzzies. But there's a lot more than that going on here. And when you consider the movie's audience and message, you can see how this opening is laying out a pretty expansive narrative in concise, emotional, cinematic language. Basically, it's showing its audience how idyllic society would be if we were the uniformly patriotic Christian nation that Jesus and our founding fathers intended. A wholesome land of firefighters and praying sports teams and flags. And look at how darn sympathetically human the Christians are as they make breakfast for the elderly, face comically bad luck with a smiling, patient Christian version of exasperation, or earnestly study the Bible. Hell, the whole thing's even set during a beautiful sunrise heralding a new day in this middle American paradise. Of course, nobody thinks this is literally what every day looks like, especially parts like the weather, but as reliably as rain at a funeral scene, it evokes an emotion that you attach to what you're seeing. And in this case, it paints a lovely picture of what could be. This is the kind of society you want, it tells its audience. The kind of society they are out to attack. Sure, Christians aren't perfect, but as long as we keep God at the center of things, life will be good. You know, basically America will be great again. In the evangelical mindset, Jesus, not a complex array of socio-political and educational factors, fixes society, and removing Jesus destroys society. But while that all looks nice, we pretty quickly see the other shoe drop. Because of course we'll need to show these well-meaning Christians being besieged by the world, as the movie starts interrupting these images of wholesomeness with juxtaposing glimpses of all the insidious secular jackals who are waiting for their chance to rush in and wreck it all because they hate God and or are just generally mean. The first dialogue in this movie, and I mean literally the first dialogue, is atheist parents telling their daughter to hurry and get over her brother's death and saying they're too busy to drive her to school.
Brooke, we're all upset, but we need to move on.
Honey, you're a junior now. It's your make or break year, so there's no room for self-pity.
Can you give Marlene and I a ride to school today?
I'm sorry, honey. I don't have time.
Which is really all the parenting an atheist can be bothered with, am I right? When suddenly their cold atheistic indifference is interrupted by an outburst of emotion over the only things you'd logically care about without God, money and business.
I have an 8:30 with Mark Shelley at White and Wolf.
What? Richard, you didn't say anything. How did you get the meeting?
Which they're busy celebrating as their neglected child walks out the door unnoticed. And just in case that wasn't laying it on thick enough for you, this business is with Mark Shelley, which, if you're not excessively familiar with God's Not Dead, is a callback to this atheist/psycho from the first movie. And notice what they have on their wall. This weird, ugly picture that looks smeared with blood and says, "Game over," because I guess atheists decorate their houses with ugly that thematically reflects the callous attitude about death that they're currently displaying. Seriously, this is a weird prop, and it wasn't placed directly over a character's shoulder in this scene by accident. Of course, these parents' sociopathic detachment from the death of one child and the emotional well-being of another is immediately contrasted by how a Christian looks after family, as we switch to our hero Grace doting over her grandpa and making sure he has a good healthy breakfast before she grades papers and goes to school. Just to make sure we're clear about the difference between Christians and atheists. And by the way, I used to be an English teacher, and unless she's feeding him breakfast in the dead of night, she'll barely have time to do a good job grading one paper between now and the start of class. Now naturally, the moment she gets to the devil's atheistic stronghold in the community, and by that I mean the public school teacher's lounge, Grace is surrounded by grumpy burnouts who can't stand kids because they apparently aren't filled with the love of Christ and thus don't see the difficult ones as blessings like she does. They probably don't play cool games with their kids like she does and aren't as amazingly engaging and personable as she is. And by the way, this game would be a useless classroom management nightmare for several reasons, including the number of students who are inactive. Leading that pack of wolves is Grace's in-school foil, that lady whose name even I don't remember, who's ready to retire and be done with these little shits, and will later act shocked to learn that the word Jesus passed between someone's lips on school property.
What were you thinking, Grace?
What were you thinking, Grace?
In short, this scene gives us a valuable look into what public schools are like in the imaginations of fundamentalist Christians. Oh, and you also need a principal demanding no moments of silence and requests to stamp out any sign of anything that can be construed as Christian, so let's make sure to have that. This is all done very effectively in a very short period of time, so that by the time the out-of-town secular liberals swoop in to smack Grace down for alluding to the Bible in class, Christians already have a vivid feeling of what kind of society they should be allowed to live in and who's trying to take it from them. And it kicks the movie off with some pretty fair momentum, setting the stage for the next big thing it does well, which is 2. It effectively misrepresents a complaint of religious overreach in schools. Now, if I were to ask you what's dumb about this movie, you'd probably say things like that Grace got in trouble just for discussing the character of Jesus in purely relevant, legal hypothetical terms during a class discussion, or the ACLU lawyers swarmed in like a SWAT team to make an example of her when in real life they would have defended her. or that Brooke's parents emotionally neglect her because they're baffled by human emotions like grief since they're atheists, and then later use her as a publicity tool so they can make sure she fulfills their wishes for her college future. These are the obvious things we roll our eyes at when thinking of this movie. But while it might be tempting to dismiss them as just a sloppy collection of stereotypes and misrepresentations, I think they were carefully designed to feed into an elaborate, it pains me to say brilliantly intricate, attempt to misrepresent what's happening when teachers proselytize and why people challenge them when they do. All these factors were used to set up an absurdly unlikely situation in which a teacher practically had to proselytize, at least in the minds of the movie's intended audience, and in which doing so was an act of kindness welcomed by the student rather than an abuse of power. I can't overemphasize how important this reinvented situation is to the movie's central point. To see why, let's look at what really happens in a complaint of religious overreach by a teacher. 1. A teacher does something that at least arguably teaches religious doctrine, coerces students into religious behavior, or makes them feel put on the spot or out of place for not being part of a particular religion. 2. The student is the aggrieved party, and the school, parents, or legal organizations are merely taking action on behalf of the student in their interest. Sometimes this might be at the direct request of the student, and at other times the concerns might be raised by a parent. 3. In many cases the complaint, or if necessary lawsuit, is pursued anonymously. Far from seeking notoriety, the student and family try to resolve the issue quietly, often because they live in places where it doesn't exactly pay to be the non-religious family that complained. And 4. The point is to put an end to the unconstitutional practice and maintain a non-intrusive learning environment. Usually the situation is corrected in-house by the school without either of these things happening. Now, is this necessarily what happens in every scenario? Well, I guess maybe not. But while there might be weird outliers, this is the typical scenario, and it's the type secular activists are actually concerned about. So why doesn't God's Not Dead 2 deal with this? I'm pretty sure it's because they don't want to touch this actual situation with a 10-foot pole for an obvious reason, which is that they can't just openly portray the kind of aggressive overreach they're fantasizing about on screen. The student is clearly the sympathetic party in this real-life situation, and the teacher is the bad guy. So rather than showing a secular high schooler being the victim of the actual evangelical agenda, and thus having to publicly own this agenda, the makers of God's Not Dead 2 concoct a series of situations that even individually are outrageously unlikely and taken together add up to a frankly implausible series of coincidences, and uses them to construct a frankly absurd alternative scenario in which 1. The teacher in this movie does two main things. One is make a simple benign reference to Jesus in the classroom, and the other is suggest that a student turn to Jesus for hope. Now the first is just a totally irrelevant red herring. Few if any actual atheists would take any issue with it, and it's not what evangelicals are going for since, they're already able to do it. Yet it's by far the bigger focus of the movie, probably because it indulges persecution fantasies about how you can't even say the name of Jesus in school, while letting the second incident fall under the radar for most of the runtime. It's this second one, however, that's really at the heart of this movie, as it comes closer to representing the actual evangelical goal of letting teachers proselytize to students, and is the only one that anybody would make a plausible legal objection to. And the pains they take in setting up this second incident is where this gets really interesting. First, notice that this conversation happens outside the classroom, a highly unlikely occurrence that's specifically chosen because it looks less egregious than in-class proselytizing. Seriously, the movie is so deliberate about moving this out of the classroom that it has the student lie and say she's okay in class, then approach the teacher later.
Are you okay? I'm fine. Are you sure? Yeah, thanks. I lied.
Basically, the movie's trying to represent this issue using an atypical situation that implies as little fault as possible on the part of the teacher. Second, as I mentioned, the student approaches the teacher asking for help, which of course is designed to take the proactivity out of the teacher's hands. Third, the student is grieving and likely traumatized following the death of her brother, and as the conversation unfolds, it becomes clear that, fourth, and this is really the key, the student has no support system because her parents, being atheist and all, are of no help and in fact undermine her emotionally. This is where it becomes clear that the stereotypical portrayal of the parents was not just a haphazard jab at atheists. It was carefully calculated to put Brooke in a vulnerable place with nowhere else to turn, which in turn puts other adults who encounter her in a place of feeling responsible for her well-being. This is even foreshadowed when the kindly, of course obviously Christian volunteer from the Salvation Army briefly reaches out to her before sadly having to leave her at the mercy of her atheist parents without being able to do more. So the movie's making it clear that this encounter presents Grace with a dilemma. Either intervene or leave Brooke in a horribly vulnerable place with literally no responsible adult support. I can't say enough to emphasize the importance of this, because the encounter does not work without this highly contrived set of circumstances. Without them, Grace is just preaching to a student. Like when this happens in the real world. But with them, her offer of Jesus becomes a lifeline thrown to a desperate student who needs and is asking for it. Of course, there are many more careful secular ways Grace could have offered help, but remember that the intended audience thinks Jesus is the answer, so you don't exactly have to move mountains to convince them that suggesting him was the only responsible thing Grace could have done at this point. Once the nature of the teacher's action is construed this way and Brooke is put on her side, the rest becomes easy. 2. The complaint comes from two places. The initial report is from a kid in the class, but we don't hear more about him, because all we need to know is he's a snotty little rat who tattles on Grace just because he heard her say the word Jesus, and of course is using his cell phone during class. This is escalated by Brooke's parents who, the movie makes abundantly clear, are operating not on her behalf but against her wishes. It's also worth noting that the principal seems hungry to make a literal federal case out of this incident, in spite of Brooke, whereas most real-life school administrators don't have time for this kind of shit and would just want to put out the fire. 3. Of course, the parents pursue this whole thing loudly and aggressively because they want the notoriety. They're not concerned about retribution from the community because remember, loud atheists and Christian communities have nothing to fear in God's not dead land. And 4. Of course, the reason they want this attention is crass gain, because remember what else matters to atheists, in the form of their daughter getting into a better college. They seem to have no principled stand or concern for the educational environment. This all makes sense to the intended audience, because they see colleges as so uniformly atheistic and liberal that being a pot stirrer with a history of causing educators legal headaches is a good thing instead of a massive red flag. As long as you're a liberal atheist. This contorted misrepresentation of the issue is perhaps the cleverest and most effective part of this movie. And it makes this a pretty natural successor to the God's Not Dead narrative. As I said in my previous review, the first movie portrayed Christianity as just a besieged little religion just sitting there minding its own business when others storm in to persecute it for no reason at all. God's Not Dead 2 extends that same narrative to a situation in which Christianity does overstep. It misconstrues a church-state violation by a teacher, one of the most egregious violations of the trust we place in them, and one a Christian would never tolerate if it were a different religion, as just one more situation in which innocent do-gooders, this time a teacher and an interested student, are just sitting there enjoying their Christianity when outsiders kick in the doors to bust them up for no reason other than malice or the possibility of personal gain. This narrative switch feels natural to evangelicals because they've already prepped themselves for it by pretending this is just a question of students being allowed to read their Bibles and pray in school, thus pretending they're just fighting for First Amendment rights students already have, instead of trying to violate their First Amendment rights by subjecting them to religious instruction in a government-funded captive environment. But there's an even more deeply rooted underlying idea at work here. They see their message as something everybody is searching for deep down, and they think if they just radiate the joy of the Lord in their daily lives, those with open hearts will approach them asking, "What makes you so happy and how can I find it too?" As Brooke is accommodating enough to ask in almost as many words.
You never let anything get to you. How do you do that? Jesus.
Because their lives are so desperate and they've tried everything, yet it all leaves them empty because it can't fill that God-shaped hole inside them. It sounds fantastical, but that's how Christians see themselves in their message. So in their eyes, when atheist meanies try saying there's any situation in which it's inappropriate for them to proselytize, It's not just part of an evenly applied effort to keep government officials from pushing any religion in their official capacity. It's cruelly stopping desperate people like Brooke from reaching out for help in their time of need and blocking Christians from offering the one thing that will help them. As long as they indulge this self-aggrandizing view of their place in the world, they're going to misunderstand why people oppose them. And indeed, they're going to misunderstand their own attempts at grabbing theocratic control as an act of mercy to the very people they're wronging. That's why the far-fetched portrayal of this incident makes sense to this movie's audience, and indeed resonates with them. So God's Not Dead 2 sets the stage by giving itself a pretty effective core deception to work with. But fortunately it goes on to fumble in spectacular fashion, squandering any opportunity this initial narrative might have afforded it. And that's what I'll have the tremendous pleasure of discussing next time. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, A Little Logic, Daniel Bostet, Nidemos, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.